It was supposed to be a routine panel on criminal justice reform, a televised discussion featuring prominent Democratic leaders including Vice President Kamala Harris and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The stage was set with polished chairs, muted backlighting, and a buzzing audience eager to hear these women weigh in on issues like sentencing disparities and police accountability. From the outset, tension simmered beneath the surface. Crockett, a rising star in the progressive wing of the party, was known for her blunt style and unapologetic stance on civil rights. Harris, a former prosecutor, often walked a fine line between reformist rhetoric and establishment policies. As the moderator posed a question about prosecutorial discretion, Crockett took the opportunity to criticize the historic role of prosecutors in perpetuating systemic injustices. Her remarks, though measured, clearly struck a nerve. Kamala Harris, leaning forward with a tight smile, interjected. "Well, Jasmine," she began, with a hint of condescension, "some of us have actually had to make decisions in real courtrooms, not just deliver speeches. You might want to understand the full picture before pointing fingers." There was a subtle gasp in the audience. Jasmine Crockett raised her eyebrows but didn't respond immediately. The look on her face said everything: calm, confident, calculating. She wasn't going to let this slide. But she would pick her moment. The room fell silent as Crockett leaned back slightly, gathering her thoughts. The cameras zoomed in, capturing her poised demeanor. She didn't fire back immediately, no need to match the vice president's tone. Instead, she waited until the moderator turned to her for a response. "With all due respect, Madam Vice President," Crockett began, her voice steady but assertive, "I've spent my career fighting for the people your policies often ignored. And yes, I may not have worn a prosecutor's badge, but I have stood beside those crushed by the weight of your decisions." There was a murmur from the audience: surprise, approval, curiosity. Harris attempted to cut in, but Crockett held up a hand, continuing smoothly. "You speak of courtrooms. Let's talk about those courtrooms, then. Because if we're going to talk about understanding the full picture, we should revisit your record. Not the speeches, not the slogans, but the cases." Suddenly, the tone of the conversation shifted. Crockett began listing them off, not with drama, but with cold precision. The parents jailed for truancy under Harris's policy as San Francisco DA, the evidence that wasn't disclosed in wrongful conviction cases. The slow response to marijuana reform despite a progressive facade. Each point hit like a drumbeat, deliberate and undeniable. Harris's expression tightened. The audience, once settled, was now visibly stirred. Crockett paused and looked directly at Harris. "So when you speak about courtrooms, I hope you remember the people on the other side of that courtroom, those without microphones or power." The moderator tried to shift topics, but the energy had changed. Crockett had set the tone, and everyone knew the discussion had just taken a turn. Kamala Harris gave a polite but forced smile, attempting to reclaim control of the room. "Well, governance requires tough choices," she said, her voice cool but slightly defensive. "And hindsight is always 20/20ths. But I stand by my record of improving lives." Crockett didn't flinch. "Improving whose lives?" she asked calmly. Because for a lot of black and brown communities, those tough choices felt more like targeted punishment. The crowd reacted again, this time more vocal. There was a mix of claps and murmurs as Crockett reached into a manila folder she had brought with her. "I wasn't planning to go here today," she said, holding up a printed article, "but since we're talking records," she began reading headlines, real ones. Kamala Harris opposed bill requiring independent investigations of police killings. Harris defended convictions despite evidence of misconduct. Harris refused to support DNA testing that could exonerate a death row inmate. She didn't embellish. She let the facts speak. Then came the moment that stopped Harris in her tracks. "Let's talk about Kevin Cooper," Crockett said. "A man on death row. There was compelling evidence suggesting he was wrongfully convicted. You had the power to order advanced DNA testing. You didn't." Harris shifted in her seat. She opened her mouth to respond, but Crockett wasn't done. You talk about evolving. Fine. But evolution doesn't erase accountability. You can't lecture others on justice while pretending your past decisions didn't cost people their futures. It wasn't just about calling out hypocrisy. Crockett was reclaiming space, challenging the notion that experience and power excuses the impact of that power on vulnerable communities. The moderator, now visibly tense, attempted to pivot, but the damage was done. Harris looked more cautious now, measured. And for the first time in the debate, she didn't interrupt. As the moderator redirected the discussion to police reform legislation, the mood remained tense. Kamala Harris, who once commanded the stage with the ease of a seasoned politician, now looked visibly more restrained, careful with her words, no longer leaning forward as aggressively. Jasmine Crockett had altered the balance of power in the room. And the audience sensed it. I believe in reform, Harris said cautiously. I've supported legislation, marched, spoken out. But there's no perfect record in public service. We grow, we learn. Crockett nodded slowly but replied with a raised eyebrow. Growth is important. But growth without acknowledgement? That's just revision. The crowd reacted again, not wildly, but with quiet affirmation. Some even nodded. And then Crockett made it personal. You know, I come from a district where people don't get the luxury of mistakes that can be explained away in a sentence. A missed court date could mean jail. A small-time drug charge could ruin someone's life. And too often, it was the policies you once stood behind that created those outcomes. She glanced over at Harris, whose face had grown unreadable. I'm not here to tear down legacies. But I won't let mine be dismissed because it didn't begin in a prosecutor's office. The audience erupted in applause, louder now, more confident. Crockett had not only defended herself, she had exposed a double standard. One that often favors establishment voices while questioning the credibility of newer, grassroots leaders. Harris shifted in her seat, managing a diplomatic smile. We're on the same side, she said quietly. But Crockett didn't let the statement sit unchallenged. Being on the same side means holding each other accountable. Not pulling rank. The panel was no longer just a discussion, it had become a moment of reckoning. Not only between two women, but between two visions of leadership in the Democratic Party. By now, the audience was hanging on every word. What began as a policy panel had transformed into a defining political moment, a generational and ideological clash playing out in real time. Sensing the shift, the moderator tried to restore balance. Let's remember this is about shared goals, she said. How do we move forward together? But the damage, or progress, depending on perspective, had already been done. Jasmine Crockett took the microphone once more. Her tone softened, but her message remained sharp. I don't believe in airing grievances for sport, she said. But I do believe in truth. And too often in politics, truth gets filtered through power, who has it, who wants it, and who's allowed to challenge it. She glanced at Harris again, not in contempt, but in clarity. We're at a point in this country where people are tired of polished answers. They want authenticity. Accountability. Leaders who don't dismiss the next generation just because we didn't come up the same way. There was something electric in the air now. It wasn't disrespect, it was disruption. Crockett wasn't attacking Harris personally. She was drawing a line between status and substance. Between political survival and political courage. To her credit, Kamala Harris didn't lash out. But she didn't quite recover, either. She leaned toward the mic and said, Congresswoman Crockett, I hear you. I do. And maybe I needed to. It was a rare moment of humility from someone who had rarely been publicly challenged so directly, and so effectively. Crockett nodded. Good, she replied. Because the people I represent. They've been waiting a long time to be heard. The audience rose, some to clap, others just to absorb what had happened. It was clear that something more than a disagreement had taken place. A line had been drawn. A new voice had emerged stronger. And the political establishment had just been reminded, no one is beyond accountability. By the time Congress reconvened that week, the tension from the panel had spilled into Washington. Lawmakers buzzed with reactions, and the lines between private whispers and public positioning grew thinner. Inside closed-door meetings, Democratic leaders discussed how to handle the messaging fallout. "She's our vice president," one senior senator grumbled. "We can't afford to have her undermined on live television." "Then maybe she shouldn't try to undermine someone else first," another shot back, more aligned with the progressive camp. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett returned to the Hill to a hero's welcome among younger lawmakers and progressive staffers. Some approached her with quiet words of admiration, others with bolder praise. "About time someone said it. Glad you brought the facts, not just the fire." But not everyone was pleased. Whispers of party disunity began to swirl. The centrist wing viewed Crockett's public takedown of Harris as a breach of internal decorum. "We don't attack our own that way," one staffer was overheard saying. Yet Crockett remained unfazed. In a brief press gaggle outside the Capitol steps, she addressed the moment with characteristic clarity. "I didn't come to D.C. to protect egos. I came to protect the people who sent me here. That means holding anyone accountable, no matter their title." Reporters immediately latched onto the quote. Headlines splashed across news sites: "Crockett holds her ground after Harris clash, I didn't come here to protect egos." Democratic divide or Democratic debate? Crockett versus Harris echoes larger party struggles. Later that evening, Harris released a carefully crafted video from her office. It avoided direct mention of Crockett, but the message was unmistakable. "In public service, we must all evolve. I've made decisions, some difficult, some controversial. But I've always strived to act with integrity. And I welcome the passion of the next generation. Let's use it to build, not divide." Some called it grace. Others saw it as sidestepping responsibility. The divide wasn't just generational, it was ideological. Authenticity versus diplomacy. Ground-up activism versus top-down legacy. And for now, the lines had been drawn. In the days following the debate, Jasmine Crockett's name was everywhere, from news outlets to political podcasts to TikTok clips viewed millions of times. Hashtags like #CrockettClapback, #KamalaConfronted, and #AccountabilityIsLeadership began trending. What struck political analysts was how quickly Crockett's message resonated, especially with younger voters and activists of color. Her words had cracked something open, not just about Kamala Harris, but about a larger frustration boiling beneath the surface of Democratic politics. In interviews, Crockett remained firm. "I didn't go there to embarrass anyone," she told MSNBC. "But I also won't sit quietly while being spoken down to. That's not how leadership works in 2025. Grassroots groups took notice. Civil rights organizations, justice reform advocates, and progressive PACs began lifting Crockett as a symbol of bold accountability and fearless truth-telling. "She said what many of us have been thinking for years," said one activist from Georgia. "And she said it to someone in power. That takes guts." Meanwhile, within the Biden-Harris administration, advisors scrambled to contain the fallout. Some feared that the incident would deepen existing skepticism about Harris's ability to galvanize the base ahead of the election season. "We need to control the narrative," one aide reportedly said. "Otherwise, this becomes a defining moment, and not in our favor." But it was already too late for containment. Crockett supporters began organizing town halls and digital forums using the confrontation as a springboard to discuss larger themes: mass incarceration, justice reform, intergenerational divides, and black leadership in the Democratic Party. Even on Capitol Hill, lines were being redrawn. Some younger members privately approached Crockett, asking how they could help amplify the message without seeming disloyal to leadership. She told them, "This isn't about tearing anyone down, it's about pulling all of us forward." Kamala Harris, for her part, stayed mostly silent in public. But the moment had clearly left its mark. She had underestimated Jasmine Crockett. And the country had just witnessed what happens when you try to silence a voice that's finally being heard. Weeks later, the moment still echoed, not just on social media, but in the halls of power, strategy sessions, and campaign war rooms. What Jasmine Crockett had done wasn't just challenge Kamala Harris. She had redefined the boundaries of who gets to speak, and how loudly, within the Democratic Party. In districts across the country, candidates began invoking Crockett's words during local debates. Her exchange with Harris became required viewing for young activists being trained in political communication. Even college classrooms used it as a case study in generational conflict, race, and institutional accountability. Meanwhile, major outlets started to profile Crockett in earnest. Not fluff pieces, but serious features. The future of progressive power. Jasmine Crockett isn't waiting her turn. From Texas to the national stage, how one Congresswoman changed the Democratic conversation. And Kamala? Her team tried to course-correct. She quietly met with civil rights leaders and scheduled interviews with trusted black journalists to reaffirm her commitment to reform. But the image of that debate, of being publicly checked by a younger, unapologetic black woman, couldn't be edited away. At a private donor dinner in D.C., Harris was asked what she made of the Crockett moment. Her reply was brief: "We need more strong voices. I just didn't expect one of them to come for me on live TV." The room laughed nervously. But Harris didn't smile. Back in Texas, Crockett held a rally. The crowd was double what her team expected. She didn't even mention Harris's name. She didn't need to. The crowd knew why they were there. "I'm not in this for spotlight or clout," she told them. "I'm in this because people are tired of being spoken at, and ready to be spoken for." The crowd roared. She had gone from junior congresswoman to national force. And all it took was one moment of being belittled, for the country to realize that maybe the future of Democratic leadership wasn't waiting its turn. It was already here. Though the televised clash had faded from the daily news cycle, its ripple effects were only growing deeper behind the scenes. Inside Democratic National Committee circles, strategists were grappling with an uncomfortable truth: Jasmine Crockett had struck a chord the party could no longer ignore. Party leadership held urgent meetings, not about discipline, but direction. "The base is changing," one senior advisor admitted during a closed-door strategy session. "And if we don't make space for these voices, they'll take it," loudly. Some feared Crockett's rise would fracture the party. Others saw it as a necessary reckoning. One aide to a top Democratic senator was overheard saying, "The energy's with her. And frankly, it's earned." Kamala underestimated her, and got reminded that old titles don't protect you from real accountability anymore. Meanwhile, Crockett was being quietly courted. High-profile fundraisers reached out, progressive donors called her the future, and organizations that had long felt sidelined by establishment politics now saw her as a potential bridge. She was invited to keynote panels, speak on Sunday shows, and even advise on upcoming policy proposals tied to justice reform and racial equity. But Crockett was careful not to become absorbed by the same institutions she challenged. "I don't want to be their next polished product," she told a trusted colleague. "I want to stay sharp enough to call them out, and smart enough to make change from the inside." Back at the White House, Kamala Harris remained focused, but distant. Internally, some questioned whether she had lost the emotional pulse of the movement she once helped inspire. Others believed this might be her moment to adapt. A Harris campaign aide confided to a reporter off the record, "She's not angry. She's thinking. But it's clear, Crockett hit something real. And if we don't evolve fast, we're going to keep getting humbled." The party, once carefully choreographed around hierarchy and legacy, was now experiencing a shakeup, live, raw, and necessary. And Jasmine Crockett? She was already planning her next town hall. No flashy event. Just a mic, folding chairs, and the same commitment that got her this far: tell the truth, even if it shakes the room. Because the ground had shifted. And Crockett wasn't just standing on it. She was shaping it. Months passed, and yet the reverberations from that one televised moment between Kamala Harris and Jasmine Crockett still echoed, not as a scandal or soundbite, but as a symbol. It had marked a turning point, a flash of raw honesty that couldn't be repackaged or spun away. Inside party headquarters, leadership finally acknowledged it. A new era was arriving, and Jasmine Crockett wasn't alone. She had become the catalyst for a movement within the Democratic Party that was no longer content with surface-level unity or empty slogans. Young lawmakers began rising up, not in rebellion, but in conviction. They formed coalitions, drafted bold legislation, and demanded that the party stop offering performative justice and start delivering structural change. Crockett often served as their anchor, not as a figurehead, but as proof that disruption and leadership could coexist. And Kamala? She remained vice president, but her image was irrevocably reshaped. She had weathered the moment, but never truly recovered her footing with the base that once championed her rise. To her credit, she leaned into the reckoning, hosting private meetings with grassroots organizers, revisiting past policy stances, even supporting a few of Crockett's justice reform bills in quiet alliance. But it was clear, she had become a bridge between eras, not the face of the future. Then came the National Convention. It was expected to be a formality. Instead, it became a coronation of the party's transformation. Jasmine Crockett walked onto that stage not as a protester on the fringes, but as the keynote speaker. The arena pulsed with energy. Delegates, activists, media, everyone leaned in as she approached the podium, no notes in hand. "I was told I should wait my turn," she began, voice calm and clear. "But the truth is, our communities couldn't wait. Our justice couldn't wait. Our future couldn't wait." The crowd erupted. She continued, "This party does not belong to the past. It belongs to the people. And if we're going to lead this nation, then we have to lead with honesty, not hierarchy. Courage, not comfort." That night, her speech dominated every network. Not just because of what she said, but because it felt like the torch had been passed, whether the old guard was ready or not. By morning, headlines read, "Crockett shifts the center of Democratic power, the voice that refused to wait, now leads the way." Kamala may have been the first, but Jasmine may be next. Backstage, Harris watched from a monitor, surrounded by her team. When Crockett's name rang out in standing ovation, the room fell quiet. Kamala nodded. "She's ready," she said softly. And maybe that's exactly what we needed. Because in politics, legacy is not what you leave behind, it's who you make room for. And Jasmine Crockett had just taken her seat at the table, not by invitation, but by force of truth.